This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. So, getting into it, Annie from Ireland says, I have moral scrupulosity OCD with a particular fear of being found out or outed by the group. With all the discussion of epigenetic changes, I couldn't help but think of my Armenian heritage on my mother's side and the history of civil wars she lived through. Could my OCD be a malfunctioning genetic compensation to keep me safe? Or is this type of OCD more environmental than genetic?
So, this is a heavy duty question on a number of levels. First off, implied by the question, referring to both some individual suffering and some historical suffering, and could there be a connection between the two? And also heavy duty in terms of there's a lot of pieces to unpack here. So, first off, moral scrupulosity, OCD. We all know about the garden variety versions of OCD. You obsess over cleanliness, you have compulsions to clean over and over. You obsess and are driven to compulsions about symmetry, numerosity, significance of entering, leaving places of heavy duty meaning. This is a very different type, and I think overall a rarer type of OCD. This is not just that you're not a good person in your actions, but as defined by DSM, it is not just you're not a good person, not just you have done bad acts, but that at your core, you are a bad human. You are a damaging one, you are a sinful one, you are an inconsiderate one, you are a selfish, self-interested one to the point of damaging those around you. It is one where the fear, the dis-ease of the disease is at the very core of how you think of yourself. The obsessive elements, replaying conversations in your head over and over, what I said that was hurtful, what I said that was not giving enough, permeated with senses of guilt and shame. The compulsions taking this form of compulsively apologizing for your actions, confessing to the rotten core of your actions, even to the point of delusionally seeing yourself as having been responsible for bad outcomes you had nothing to do with. Avoiding social settings where you fear that you will inevitably harm those around you with your implicit rottenness, where you're constantly seeking assurance from those around you, moral assurance that you didn't do a terrible thing, that you're not an awful person. And of course, as is a defining feature of all these versions of OCD, it is something that dominates your days, disrupts normal functioning, and is a source of enormous psychic distress. Now, there's subtypes focusing in on its effect on how much you are acting to avoid doing harm avoidance of a very special type. Obsessing over, am I a just person? Was this an unjust thing that I did? A sense of hyper responsibility in circumstances where you could not possibly be responsible, and of focusing in on, was I being truthful? Was I inadvertently giving an impression that I was not being truthful, where people would perhaps perceive that incorrectly? And this leading to compulsions of qualifying what you said, over explaining, trying to convince the person what you were convinced of internally, that you were not an awful, damaging person. Implicit in that is a thought action fusion. Your thoughts can be as sinful, can be as damaging, could be as reflective of the rottenness of who you are at the core. Your thoughts and your actions are inseparable. Thought can be sin. And where do you see this arising from? All the usual roots of OCD, but in these cases, often a rigid, highly judgmental, highly punitive upbringing, one where moral uprightness, whatever flavor was being dictated in your family, was a condition for love, so parental conditional love. And what it might also suggest is a particular domain that gives rise to this developmentally, culturally. And a great example of moral scrupulosity, OCD, a historical one. This was a 16th century monk, traumatic upbringing, a very violent, abusive father, a neurasthenic, nervous, hypochondriacal, neurotic, anxious kid growing up. In his late youth, early 20s, he's caught in an unexpected thunderstorm out in a field someday, has an utter panic attack, and says to God, if you save me from this, I will devote my life to you. He survives the thunderstorm and becomes an Augustinian monk. And he becomes a monk like out the wazoo, over the top there, consumed with ritualism, consumed with hours and hours of prayer each day. The first time he runs a service on his own, he extends it because he's got to redo this part because he wasn't thinking clearly enough and devotedly enough because he stumbled over this word. A total mess, and a total mess taking a particular angle of this moral scrupulosity, OCD. He had a father confessor there who he would meet with daily to confess to his daily sins. He was like living basically a life of enforced silence and monasticism, not giving him a whole lot of room for sinfulness. Nonetheless, every day generating hours worth of sins to confess, built around moral scrupulosity. When I said this prayer, I was not thinking only of God. When I did this, I had these thoughts indicative of me as an awful person. I was distracted when supposedly thinking about this over and over and over. God is going to be angry at me for being this rotten person. And as recorded, this father confessor had a shockingly modern insight, interpretation, psychotherapeutic angle that he took at some point that no doubt, like umpteen days into umpteen hours of this guy confessing, I stumbled over this and this is proof I'm a bad person and God is going to be angry at me. He finally got fed up and said, you didn't do anything wrong. God isn't angry at you. For some reason, you were very angry at God. And this was shockingly insightful. And why do we know so much about this guy and know so much about the obsessive journal keeping that he wrote about? This Augustinian monk, known by his German name of Luther, was Martin Luther. Martin Luther, who took his anger at God and anger at his apparently actually murderous father and anger at all sorts of authority figures to having the biggest pushback in the history of turning individual neurosis into history-changing events. So this is what the moral scrupulosity looks like, the obsessiveness with it. Now, what this brings us to is Annie's particular question. What might this have to do with the history of, as she very gently, perhaps overly politely says, the history of the Armenian Civil War? And in reality, it wasn't much of a civil war. It was the famed, horrible Armenian Genocide. So what was that about? The Armenian Genocide was most historically famous for, during World War I and in the years afterward, massive, massive destruction of the Armenian population in Turkey by the Ottoman Turk population there. Now, some history about the history. The Armenians, separate ethnic group that was living in eastern Turkey many, many centuries before the Ottoman Turks came. They had been Christian for quite a number of centuries before the Muslim Ottoman Turks came in and conquered much of the region. And everything about what happened subsequently is in that context. So the myths around it are many. One myth being that this was just an outcome of the chaos of World War I. There was just chaotic violence all over the place. This was not a special case. And one thing against that was that it persisted quite a few years on a massive level after World War I during the Turkish War of Independence. And most of all, as a myth, was that it was a singular event. This had been going on for many, many decades before. There was a history of Armenian Christians being tolerated as like not especially popular second-class citizens in the Ottoman Empire for quite some time, but nonetheless periods of appalling outbreaks of massive anti-Armenian violence. In the 1890s, there was an outburst of anti-Armenian violence which left hundreds of thousands of individuals dead. And this was governmentally condoned, either in the passive form of allowing the troops to look the other way or allowing those uniformed folks to just not miss out on the fun and jump in on it. 1909, there was another outburst of it. Another 17,000 Armenians were killed then. But the real main act came in the World War I, post-World War I period. And what you had there was, at the time, 15% of the population of what is now Turkey was Armenian Christians. And during that time, there was the eradication of anywhere from 800,000 to 1.2 million Armenians. Some of it could be framed as just getting rid of those folks in a relatively benign way, which was forcing hundreds of thousands of Armenians to leave their homes and march through the deserts of Syria, where, what do you know, a whole lot of them died of the elements there. But this was nonetheless an organized killing on a level going up to the highest levels of government. This was a mechanized, industrialized process. There were camps at which displaced Armenians were being concentrated. There were train shipments of them. There were massive mass graves dug by the Turks in preparation for mowing down the people brought there. Basically, they were an opening act for the Nazis in terms of this being a planned, top-down, organized process. The killing was so extreme, just as some of the details, the Tigris and the Euphrates were so clogged up with the corpses of slaughtered Armenians that explosives had to be used to break the body-formed dams that were overflowing the rivers. All sorts of disease outbreaks occurred downriver because of the bodies accumulating there. And this was really one of those special types of destruction. And we've talked about one special version of it. You know, all sorts of people have been outgrouped, subject to all sorts of horrible treatment. One version of the specialness, something noted, applies to Jews, which is the special historical possibility that the Jews could be villainized for having been both communist Bolsheviks and being capitalists manipulating the world. With the Armenians, there was a special version of it all, which is that these mass killings stretched over decades with remarkably different governments in Turkey, spanning the fall of the Ottoman Empire, a secular revolution in Turkey, remarkably different governments, which nonetheless were all overseeing, to some extent at least, the massacre of the populace of Armenians. So, of course, historians have argued endlessly as to what this was about, and a little bit of it was the World War I chaos. And what do you know? Wars are particularly bad for outgroup members, but lots of other possibilities. The Armenians, of course, being outsiders, not outsiders in the current sense of immigrants being victimized, but rather religious outsiders. They were Christians in an overwhelmingly Muslim country, so that was part of it. Also a very familiar theme, while the majority of the Armenians were peasant farmers, nonetheless, they disproportionately dominated the mercantile class. They were, in those sectors, better off financially. The hated out group that's making a lot of money scenario was playing out there. In the period around the largest massacres, there was ethnic cleansing and massacres of Muslims in the Balkans during the wars. So a lot of this was viewed as retributive. Of course, there was a nonsensical view that the Christian Armenians were going to be a fifth column within Turkey, helping the outside Christians. And there's essentially no historical evidence of this having happened. So all sorts of possibilities that gave rise to it, multi-explanation, multifactorial. This is so often the case. And one of the really charming features of all of it is that Turkey and all of its governmental incarnations since then continues to refuse the term genocide to explain what happened. And when Turkey was allowed into the European Union, they made some feeble promises to formally recognize it as a genocide, which kind of got lost in the hubbub of signing all those forms and all the EU celebrations. The government of Turkey formally does not recognize that this was a genocide. This was, a lot of people got killed during the war and civilian deaths and extremes of not formally recognized. I have met people from Turkey who are recognizably sane, sensible, empathic people who nonetheless insist that there was no genocide. It was just people, refugees everywhere, lots of people dying. This was not a planned top-down event. And at this point, there are 3 countries that formally refuse to recognize that there was anything genocidal that occurred, which is Turkey, Azerbaijan, which is sort of updated anti-Armenian violence into a whole new sector, and Pakistan. There's 34 countries that have formally recognized what occurred as a genocide. And for me, really impressively, those 34 countries include 3 Muslim majority countries, Syria, Lebanon, and Libya. So enormous respect for them doing that. Some statistics just to underline all of this is shown here in this visual. These are data that were collected by the architects of the genocide themselves, Turkish authorities, as to what percentage of Armenians were eliminated during that period, province by province. And in black, you see there the bulk of those cases, 100% of Armenians were gone afterward. So infinite perpetual shame on any government that would deny that this occurred and deny that this was a planned genocide. So of course, what this brings us to now is, do those events have any explanatory power looking at the descendants of the Armenian survivors of the genocide and making sense of psychiatric challenges at this point? And this brings us to the topic of intergenerational transmission of trauma. Just to start off as a clarification, not talking about multi-generational transmission in the case of individual trauma, the descendants of spousal abuse, families with domestic violence, child abuse, so on. In this case, larger scale versions. And we see all sorts of versions of that on the larger scale. There was a classic sociology study published some decades ago, a wonderful book called The Hidden Injuries of Class by Richard Sennett and Jonathan Cobb, showing decades after the descendants of the poor working class in this country have gotten out of that into upper middle class or even upper class, there are residual aspects of imposter syndrome, anxiety, fear of being found out, so on. So that's a relatively benign realm of it. What most of the literature is about is looking at the descendants of traumatic trauma, looking at the descendants of American slavery, the descendants of the Holocaust, the Armenian Genocide, genocide, the Rwandan Tutsi genocide, indigenous populations, First Nation people in Canada, Native Americans, looking at the transmission, looking at the fact that even multiple generations later, everything else being equal, things aren't equal. And what that literature has mostly shown is even unto the grandchild generation, and no doubt even further as time passes and studies accrue, you see extremely elevated rates of psychiatric maladies in this population compared to controls that were not the descendants of high rates of mood disorders, anxiety disorders, depression, high rates of antisocial delinquency in the younger individuals, high rates of substance abuse, high rates of ADHD. And the big challenge in this literature is that these are not perfectly controlled studies, which is to say that these descendants of trauma and genocide and appalling mistreatment, everything isn't now hunky-dory for them. Nothing residually bad still going on. That obviously is not the case in the United States for the descendants of American slavery. We had a whole bunch of decades of Jim Crow following that, explicitly or implicitly. So it's mighty hard to say these are descendants where everything is just fine with them now. The historicism is purely historical. The past is past. Nonetheless, sort of a rough working definition for this population is they were born, raised, and now live far away from where everything went wrong. And that's, somewhat of a difficult thing. I had a personal experience with what I think qualifies as that, which was one time when I was a kid. My father and I were walking through our neighborhood, and he, as an architect, was attuned to what was this beautiful Dutch Reformed church, and we stopped outside it, and he was going on about its construction, all of that. And he said, here, let's go through the gate and let's walk around the place there so I can point out these details. And my response was, are we going to get in trouble? Are they going to come for us because we're Jewish? We're not supposed to be near one of their churches. So that was one that was completely outside the realm of European anti-Semitism. Ironically, it turned out not to be that clean of a case a few months later when our synagogue was arsoned. But nonetheless, this is a pretty good textbook case of what the untraumatized descendants of trauma look like. So, of course, the question is, where are these changes coming from? Why the elevated rates of depression, anxiety, substance abuse? Where's that coming from? The easy explanations are behavioral ones, which is how you were raised. How you were raised in your family, how you were raised in your community, whether it was an ethos of revenge, an ethos of we are victims, we are potential victims, always look over your shoulder, that as perfectly logical routes for this going on. And you can see all sorts of cases where more than a millennia after a trauma, intertribal tensions are still quite relevant. But what's the controversial issue is looking at the biology of multi-generational transmission of trauma. And there is a biology to it. Extensive animal studies have shown traumatize animals, especially early life adversity, and not only do you get behavioral and neurobiological changes that last the lifetime of that animal, unless certain interventions occur, but where it is transmitted multi-generationally. What is that transmission about? Key thing, you are not changing the genes. You are not changing DNA sequences. This is not genetic transmission. This is non-genetic transmission, the term given for it. Non-Mendelian, Mendel, godfather of genes and the roots of genetics, non-Mendelian transition. And as noted by Annie, the most frequent version of that, the trendiest, is an epigenetic mark that is passed on multi-generationally. You are not changing the structure of the genes, you are changing the regulation of them. And what the animal study showed was all sorts of epigenetic changes passed multi-generationally and how prone these animals were towards stress responses, how prone these animals were to animal models of anxiety, depression, that you saw the same thing there. What has been very striking is some similar neurobiological scar tissue passed on epigenetically, multi-generationally, as well in humans. For example, probably the richest literature at this point is looking at the children and the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. And what studies have shown are epigenetic changes in this population in genes that are cofactors for the glucocorticoid receptor, having stress physiology written all over it, a gene called FKBP5, which is a binding protein that stabilizes the glucocorticoid receptor. On the average, different versions of it in the descendants of the Holocaust, different versions of a gene coding for an enzyme that regulates glucocorticoid levels, aficionados, 11 beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. And the controversies are how strong are these effects? What do you know? These are not gigantic study populations, and the effects themselves are not gigantic. And what are the mechanisms for it? And there's hardcore epigenetic mechanisms that are speculated, which is to say the epigenetic scars were passed on in epigenetically modified egg and sperm. Some evidence for this, more evidence for the weaker indirect version of epigenetic inheritance, which is it changes the fetal environment that this descendant sat in. It changed the childhood and thus changed the epigenetics of those individuals. And if people had to vote to the extent that these effects are there, maybe not very strong, not very consistent, but to the extent that they are there, the general sense is this is not epigenetic scarring of eggs and sperm. Instead, this is brought about through prenatal environment and upbringing. Okay, so this brings us back now to Annie's question. Insofar as she is suffering from moral scrupulosity, OCD, and she is a descendant of the Armenian Genocide, are we seeing any evidence of multi-generational transmission that might explain what she is struggling with? And what the multi-generational stuff is mostly about is generations later, you have still been taught by your people's history to be afraid. You've been taught to be sad. You've been taught to be vengeful. You've been taught to be guilty that you were one of the ones who were untouched by it. The notion that what you have been taught intergenerationally is to think of yourself as a terrible, bad person to your core, that seems a little bit less plausible to me. So my guess is the roots in this case are somewhere else.
Switching gears, our next question today is, I know that there are types of predators who hunt cooperatively, like wild dogs. I recently heard that there is a species of snake and a species of fish in the Pacific that hunt cooperatively. Is this for real?
Oh, is this fun tracking this one down? First off, yes, there are species that hunt cooperatively, and it's often hard to distinguish between organized cooperative hunting and just everybody getting in on the action in a chaotic way. Wild dogs, chimps are very well documented examples of organized group hunters. In the case of wild dogs, when they are going after a prey, there's always the danger that the prey will change direction. And what you see is some of the dogs cut corners, cut off the prey should they change direction. Chimps, when they're hunting monkeys up in the trees, some chimps will drive the monkeys in one direction, where other chimps have gone already to be in ambush. So cooperative hunting there. This is a case of cooperative hunting between two species, and it's totally cool and interesting. The protagonist of it is a type of poisonous snake in the South Pacific, Southeast Asia, called the Krait. And the Krait is a venomous snake big time, and there's all sorts of different species of kraits that you don't want to run into in the waters there. This particular one involves what's called the black-banded krait. Now, they're found off of Indonesia, Fiji, and those parts, and they're venomous. They are venomous like crazy. Their venom is 10 times as fatal as is cobra venom. Humans who were bitten by kraits, where the snake releases its full load of venom, kills 60 to 70% of humans relatively quickly, and the mechanism of it is fairly well understood. Toxin neuropharmacology, neurotoxicology people will be familiar with it, and that the venom contains a chemical which blocks what are called nicotinic cholinergic receptors, the acetylcholine system neurotransmitter made use of by the parasympathetic nervous system. It blocks these receptors, so the parasympathetic nervous system doesn't do what it's meant to do. And among that is getting your diaphragm to breathe for you. Blocks cholinergic receptors in the diaphragm. Your diaphragm doesn't work anymore, you did. And this is pretty effective. And the actual chemical has been identified. If you take an intro neuropharmacology class, it's always fun to learn this word, which has a certain jaunty feel to it. The poison is called alpha bungarotoxin, which gives rise to the Latin name of Krait, which is bungaris, and I don't know which came first. And alpha bungarotoxin works a lot like what might be more familiar, curare. Curare blocks nicotinic cholinergic receptors, most fatally in the diaphragm again. And the big difference is curare does it only temporarily. And this gives rise to the fact that often very, very modest, carefully calibrated small amounts of curare are used surgically to paralyze somebody's diaphragm when they're being put on a heart-lung machine. It's reversible. In the case of these bungarotoxins, they are not reversible, and that's where its fatality comes from. So this sounds like one hell of a predator, but straight out of like those kid board games of dinosaur competitions where each dinosaur comes with X number of points of advantages and disadvantages. The obvious advantage for these black-banded kraits is their venomousness, which is brutally effective. But of course, they got some weaknesses, and in their case, the weaknesses are twofold. First, they're not very fast by fish standards. Most fish can run away from them, and they got pretty lousy eyesight. And this is where their other species partner comes in. Two different types of fish. One is called the yellow-finned goatfish, very colorful, but most central to the trauma and drama of this is something called the giant Trevally fish. And they are gigantic. They're up to 5 feet long. And they like little fish for meals. And just to make things clear from now on, these giant trevallies will be referred to as the big mean fish. So the big mean fish have their own strengths and weaknesses. Their strength is they're big and they're fast, and their weaknesses, because they're big, they can't squeeze into little places. So lots of fish, little fish species, when the big mean ones are around, go and hide in coral reefs. And this is where the cooperation comes in. So the giant trevallies are fast and vicious, and the black-banded kraits are slow and vicious, but what they're good at is they can snake through these little corridors in the corals. So you see this remarkable cooperation where there will be a whole bunch of these big mean fish followed by a whole bunch of these kraits. And what the big mean fish do is they try to go eat some little poor fish. And if all the fish go hide in the corals, these big mean trevallies will indicate with their noses, will just bump up against the coral, indicating to the snakes they're all hiding inside there. And at that point, a swarm of the snakes dive into the little passageways of the coral. And what their incentive is, of course, is to catch some of these little fish. And this gives rise to the horror, like some camera work from inside the coral, and you see some little shivering fish there just by the camera lens, and you see the shadow of one of these snakes pass by their passageway. And what the snakes do is they go in to eat a bunch of them, and amid the process of doing that, they flush the rest of them out, where all of these trevally big mean fish are waiting to gobble them up quickly. And this is its own version of nightmarishness, because you got these big fish with these big fish lips and these cold and human eyes, which I guess you can't fault them for, but it winds up being this very successful symbiotic system. Everybody benefits from it. How it got started, who knows? But what you see is eventually, if it's a really good spot, you will get hundreds and hundreds of snakes converging on that site, diving into the coral and flushing out the payoff for the fish waiting outside. So everybody comes out. It's win-win for everybody except the little fish. So what we have, of course, is one of those, isn't evolution amazing? One hopes that there's very careful ongoing studies to make sure these trevallies are not beginning to evolve legs, because the black-banded Krait can come out on land. They come out to lay eggs. So give those fish some legs and they both get on land and we're going to be in trouble. But a remarkable piece of coevolution.
Insofar as this is a reciprocal altruism system between these species, one of the key elements of this sort of system is the occasional cheating and backstabbing. Do you get examples of cheating in some of these symbiotic systems, whether it's these species or other systems?
Well, you see it in some other cases. You got these great symbioses between some big fish species that collects barnacles or parasites on them, and then there's little fish that swim along and are tolerated because they bite off the barnacle parasites. I'm getting the details wrong here, no doubt, but where it's a win for everyone. You get deparasitized and the little fish get something to eat, and apparently every now and then there's a little bit of cheating on this game theory reciprocity scenario where the little fish will occasionally, smit the parasite and lop out a piece of the fish itself, and that usually leads to retribution afterward. To my knowledge, people are not studying yet whether this system of interspecies reciprocal altruism has cheating going on, and whether it has what also evolves with that, surveillance mechanisms against the cheating. This is a pretty recently discovered phenomenon, but wouldn't surprise me at all if that's going to turn out to be the case.
And that's all from us today. I'm Offspring Chair Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.